fungi are vital for ecosystems. People think of plants and animals all the time, but seldom of fungi. And fungi are like the connection between all of these parts of the ecosystem. I mean, they're basically mediators, if you like, between plants, animals, and microbes. And we can't see them, so we tend to not think about them or ignore them, but they're really the hidden heroes in climate, in carbon sequestration.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Climate Emergency Forum. I'm Herb Simmons, the author of A Climate Vocabulary of the Future, where today, as always, we tackle the most urgent issues facing our planet. Today is a particularly powerful, pervasive, and mysterious life form that we'll be looking at. And in case you're wondering what that might be, it's fungi. At least that's how I understand it's pronounced. Your pronunciation may be different. These remarkable organisms, they thrive everywhere, literally, from the crushing depths of the ocean to the windswept peaks of the tallest mountains. They take countless forms and they perform incredible functions that sustain all of life, including ours. And they can also be damaging to life, including ours. And we'll be looking at that whole spectrum today. You know, you might say, I was thinking about it, that they're kind of the Swiss Army knife, if you will, of organisms, because they perform so much in so many ways, many of which are hidden from us. Far more than just mushrooms and mold. They play a vital role in our ecosystems, in our soil. They store an extraordinary amount of carbon, and they underlie the health of our forests and crops. Their story is complex. Scientists are just beginning to learn the miraculous kinds of functions that they perform and the shapes they take. So I think it'll be a very exciting program today. And please make sure that after you watch this very engaging program about this hidden world, that you stay tuned as I and we will be presenting briefly some of the most important climate news of the past few days or so. So with that, as always, I'm delighted to introduce our regular panelist, Dr. Peter Carter. Good to see you, Peter. Peter comes to us from British Columbia, where he is a retired medical doctor. He's been an expert reviewer for the IPCC, and he's been the founder and manager and runs the Climate Emergency Institute. Peter, what's your take on the fungi?
Oh, well, Herb, when I heard the suggestion that we covered fungi, I guess I said, "Oh, fungi. I don't know very much about fungi, and I don't think they're, sort of right on the top of our list of problems for climate change." Well, was I ever wrong? Because I did some rapid researching. On a personal note, and maybe slightly humorous note, my wife has me on something called lion's mane. I found out that it was a fungus, actually. She's got me on it because she said it'll improve my aging brain. And I did some research on that, and indeed it does. So fungi are capable of absolutely amazing and good things, but also there's a huge worry about the effects of climate change on fungi. Now, so I did some researching, and this is the bit that really flashed out at me. And that was from one paper, and that was that fungi are a huge carbon sink. The mycorrhizal fungi, that network of spread that's all under the soil and tree roots and plant roots, that stores 13 billion tons of carbon, equivalent to 36% of annual fossil fuel greenhouse gas emissions, it says here. And it does that from absorbing carbon from CO2, goes into that underground network and soil where really it's a carbon sink because it's going to stay there for long periods. As Herb indicated, yeah, they're amazing. They are their own kingdom. We've got animals and plants and fungi. They are everywhere, as Herb said, everywhere, absolutely everywhere. They are moved around rather easily by winds and things like that. I found it fascinating that fungi are the most ancient organisms. The researchers again found that they date back to 2 billion years ago. That means there were fungi on the planet hundreds of millions of years before plants and even longer before animals. And I have come across this statement before that ancient fungi may have built the land on which we now enjoy today, working with algae that were around there, very primitive, to cycle nutrients and split rocks and get into crevices and actually start the land off. And the final thing, which I found quite often, is that if we didn't have any fungi, we'd be buried in a global planetary garbage heap because they're the great decomposers. I next started to look at agriculture, which of course has been one of my main concerns and interests for years and years and years. And that's where I discovered that far from being not a big problem, fungi are a huge, huge, potentially catastrophic global problem under global warming, global heating, and climate change. And that's because of the huge dependence of world agriculture on fungicides, chemicals, to control the fungi, which otherwise would produce massive lost crops. Now, we've got large losses of crops already, 20% before harvest and 20% after harvest. That's quite a stunning figure. Agriculture, in a way, highly successful agriculture is a little bit tenuous. The researchers are uniformly very, very concerned about what they call the potential effects of increasing fungi and decreasing the fungi sensitivity to fungicides. They're very worried about that. And indeed, there is some evidence, not much, but there is evidence emerging that this is beginning to happen. The one that's got quite a bit of publicity is bananas, because the banana industry, which of course is huge, and the banana countries depend greatly on fungicides. I just want to make a quick mention of the Irish potato famine. That was fungi. You know, the population absolutely devastated, massive numbers of people killed off. Finally, I want to say that there's a concern specifically about wheat, one of our main cereal crops, of course. There's a thing called wheat blast, which is a fungus, and that definitely, apparently, is spreading slowly on a continental basis. The potential that the experts put of fungi reducing crop harvest is huge, like 70%. So it is whoa worrying.
Thank you, Peter. That's sobering. Fungi is like the, what is it, the Greek god Janus that looks in both directions. It has enormous benefits for us and for the world and for every living creature. And of course, it wants to survive itself. And it probably doesn't say, you know, I'm going to not eat that wheat because people might like it. You know, if it needs it to survive, it'll do so. There's also the, and I guess we may talk about this later, the increase in extremely serious illnesses and diseases in humans that are caused by fungi that are expanding their range because of extreme weather from climate change. So there's a whole bunch of stuff. We could probably talk about it all day and all night. We won't. We'll relieve you all of that worry. But what we will do now is reach out to Paul Beckwith, our regular panelist. And Paul, as you know, is a climate system scientist who lives in Ottawa, has taught at universities in the Ottawa area, and he started and runs a YouTube channel with over, last time I checked, Paul, 1,600 videos and over 10 million viewers. So Paul is probably one of the most famous climate folks you'll ever run into, and we're, as always, delighted to have you here. Paul, what's your take on this fascinating kingdom? And I think kingdom is the right word. They really deserve to be a kingdom given all their influence. Let's hear your thoughts.
Yeah, this amazing form of life, because it is a separate form of life, is quite incredible. I thought one of the best ways to use fungi to deal with climate change acceleration is to get those magic mushrooms and feed them all to the fossil fuel executives so they don't have to worry so much about running their companies and extracting all those fossil fuels to burn. So people think of mushrooms often when they think of fungi, and there's more and more uses. For example, you can grow fungi with things like cotton and sawdust, and you can produce artificial leather type materials, which are actually being used by some of the mainstream companies making leather products. They're starting to use fungi produced products, which are much more environmentally friendly. But let's talk about fungi. Next time you take a walk in the forest, scrape away some of the leaves on the ground and the litter and use a spoon and scoop up a couple of, a spoonful of soil in the first couple inches. And what you'll have in that soil is a vast network of fungi. And fungi, of course, is vital for, we talk about plants sequestering carbon, trees, and so on, how they're vital for sequestering carbon. And they wouldn't be doing this sequestration without their symbiotic relationship with fungi. And fungi, of course, the mycorrhizal fungi that are in symbiotic relationships with the trees and the plants, they're intertwined in the roots, and they do remarkable processes to allow plants to sequester carbon. So the filaments of the fungi actually extend far and wide, much further and wider and deeper than the roots of the actual tree. And these microfilaments, they absorb water in the soil and they absorb nutrients in the soil, phosphorus and nitrogen and things, and they bring those nutrients to the tree, allowing the tree to grow. And the tree, in its turn, of course, there's photosynthesis. CO2 goes in the stomata of the leaves. It's converted into plant materials, and anywhere from, I think, 4 to 20% of that plant carbon actually goes back through the fungi into the roots, through the fungi, and it's sequestered into the soil, making the soils very rich. And then the nutrients are all recycled. They go from the plant to the fungi, back to the plant, and so on. So one of the things with climate change is we tend to focus on CO2 emissions, but there's also lots of nitrous oxide emissions from fossil fuel burning. And that nitrous oxide is actually very harmful to this fungi that's in symbiosis with the roots of trees. So tree coverage in many places is reducing. There was one example, in Cleveland where we had 30% tree cover, and now it's only 18% because the trees are being killed off by disease and by, too excessive heat and drought and so on. We're losing the fungi that's actually crucial for these steps, which is putting a lot of stress on the trees. Also, fungi actually gets incorporated into the cells of the plants, and it fights diseases. It protects the tree. So there's a huge symbiotic relationship, and they're tiny, and we don't think of them. We don't see them. They're underground, but they're vital for the health of ecosystems. So that they provide great benefit. And actually, there's a lot of when people talk about restoration of forests, what researchers are doing is they're taking if you take about 50 grams of soil that contains the fungi, so from an old growth forest region, the soil next to a tree, 50 grams of that, if you plant a new tree in a new area with that little bit of soil, they're finding that the tree grows much better, it's much hardier, it's much resilient, and we can actually go a long way to restoration of forests by using little packets of soil containing this fungi. And there's a lot of new research coming out on that is very, very fascinating research. Fungi are vital. I just want to say one of the negative aspects. Fungi, they grow in cooler temperatures. The soil's cooler typically. They don't generally grow at human body temperature or at the body temperature of mammals. There's a temperature barrier. The problem is as climate change accelerates, the warming, the fungi are evolving to be able to survive in warmer environments. So if the temperatures rise enough and the fungi evolve enough to thrive in warmer environments, then they can go into the human body and thrive in the human body. So there can be all kinds of very bad health effects to people from fungal infections. So this is a huge problem, right? It's the temperature barrier, which has kept diseases out of people generally, are in danger of being breached, and then fungi will become a huge health problem directly to people.
Thanks, Paul. You just mentioned the word breach. It strikes me that that breach might be one of the most important or common words used or that should be used with respect to climate change because there's so many barriers that are being breached, so many aspects of the natural and the other dimensions that are no longer safe because of breaching by temperatures, breaching by organisms, breaching by sea barriers and so forth. Maybe we should do a program on breaching climate change, what that means. It also strikes me when you talked about magic mushrooms, perhaps it's not just the fossil fuel executives who should be slipped a portion of it, but maybe some of our world leaders. I won't mention any by name because that may not be good for my future, but I think you know who I mean. The last thing I want to say in response to what you're saying is, well, Paul, when you talked about it, and I read the same story about these small packets of soil that can help trees grow faster and better and so forth. It reminds me essentially that mushrooms, as well as everything else in the soil, is acting as a kind of probiotic, the same way that a small pill we might take or a teaspoon of kombucha or whatever it's called. Similarly, mushrooms have that magic elixir that we're only beginning to understand, and which many traditional peoples, automatically knew because they used it in all sorts of ways. So with that back, Peter, are you going to continue focusing on the negative, or are you going to focus on a little bit more on the positive aspects, or both? And of course, you're invited to do whatever you want.
In the medical community, of course, fungi are held in the highest esteem, and that dates back to the accidental discovery of penicillin from the penicillium fungus by Alexander Fleming in England. And that literally changed everything in the medical and health world because serious infections, spreading infections that we couldn't treat, now we could treat. It was almost like magic. The infections cleared up in no time. The patients got better in no time. Another interesting thing, which for me at my age, is that the statins, the drugs that are used in great amounts for high blood pressure and circulatory problems, they're actually from fungi. So there's a lot of fungi still being utilized beneficially for medical and health. Now, yeah, mushrooms. I like mushrooms, and they're fungi. That's what they are. They're fungi, and they're grown and they're harvested. And I found out, much to my pleasure, that because I follow a vegan diet, that these mushrooms are high in protein. So that's really, really good. Some people will no doubt want to be reminded that fungi are essential in the making of beer and wine. And all of us should probably remember that fungi are essential for making of bread. So, onto the diseases. Oh my gosh. The one that I know is Aspergillus fungus. And I know that because it causes a horrible, horrible disease, very hard to treat, called aspergillosis, very chronic and debilitating, affects lungs and also affects the brains of people infected. So I found at least 10 different groups of fungi that cause different groups of diseases. So the potential of fungi causing more diseases in our human population and diseases that we can't treat as well as we are now, that's very, very worrying indeed. The fungus and mild infection that people probably know is candidiasis, although that's a real problem in certain patients on autoimmune suppressing drugs and medications, that sort of thing. My final point would be this. As I read all of these really, really interesting and scary scientific papers on fungi, none of them, and this is very general now, none of them suggest, they're saying that climate change is a huge problem for fungi. None of them suggest we should even reduce our emissions. That doesn't come into the scientific papers at all. Final point, when I grew up as a boy in England, there was a statement, a mantra sort of, it was sort of a law, and it was called the balance of nature. The balance of nature, when I was a boy, was huge. It sort of, everybody had to remember this and considered that, to carry on with a healthy population, and particularly with agriculture. So the ultimate disruption of the balance of nature is, of course, global heating and climate disruption. We should be really, really, really way more worried about that than apparently we are.
Well said. And you covered much ground there. Reminds me when I was in England this summer and I got off at Paddington Station and was walking a couple blocks and looked up, and there was a plaque saying, in this room, 20 feet above me was where Alexander Fleming basically came up with or discovered or noticed, whatever the word is, the fungi that led to penicillin, and it was sort of gave me a little bit of a shiver there. And that we did a program, I think, on the climate microbiome some time ago, and there was a warning from scientists a few years ago about the impact of climate change will depend heavily on the response of microorganisms. And it was kind of a call for a plea for more research and more focus. And I think one could say the same thing about fungi and the need to bring them out of the underground, out of the shadows, so that we can study and understand them, use them where we can, and minimize their negative consequences where we can't. So back to Paul.
Yeah, so I'll just emphasize, I often talk about the overall climate system and think from a systems point of view. And fungi are vital for ecosystems. People think of plants and animals all the time, but seldom of fungi. And fungi are like the connection between all of these parts of the ecosystem. I mean, they're decomposers, as you've said, Herb. They're definite nutrient cyclers, taking nutrient in different forms from the soils to forms that can be used by the plants. And then the plants, when they expel them, the fungi actually bring them back into a different form to allow them to be sequestered in the soils, etc. So they're basically mediators, if you like, between plants, animals, and microbes. And we can't see them, so we tend to not think about them or ignore them, but they're really the hidden heroes in climate, in carbon sequestration. I'll have to do a t-shirt with that logo, fungi, the hidden heroes. There is a good website called reasonstobecheerful.world. They talk about all the benefits of fungi and the different research. There's a group called SPUN, Society for the Protection of Underground Networks, and they did a big study recently. They used artificial intelligence to map networks of fungi around the world, and they came up with they published this in the journal Nature, and they basically had a high resolution maps of this fungi, which is symbiotic with plant roots, the mycorrhizal fungal networks. Soils are very important. We've done a separate program, I think, on soils and the importance of soils for sequestration. And, they wouldn't be doing their carbon storage without these fungi within them. Also, the fungi, the small intertwined roots of the fungi, plus the roots of the tree, they bind soils. They contain soil erosion. They retain moisture, which is very important. The moisture retention in soils, especially during droughts, because, the soils moisture can keep plants going through a large part of droughts because the water's deeper down in the soils and can be accessed by the fungi. And of course, the carbon sequestration is vital. Also, fungi, we're finding out that they can actually decompose not just plant material and animal material, but they can actually decompose pollutants and toxins. And there's even some suggestions that they might be able to decompose some types of plastics, which of course is vital. So there's a huge interconnection of all living organisms by, microorganisms, including things like fungi. So they're vital. So with climate change, with warming, changing water cycles, and increased extreme weather events and more variability, the fungi, we can't just ignore them. I mean, things like nitrous oxide, like I've said, deposits a lot of nitrogen and actually harms the beneficial fungi in forests. So this is why forest restoration, reducing tree mortality, is vital for maintaining terrestrial carbon stores, and that's through fungi. And you can actually take degraded land and start putting trees in it, and the fungi can just kind of magically appears in these places. So we don't know why. Is it transferred from other regions? Is it carried in air currents? Is it spores that are in the soil which then spring back to life? So there's a lot of things to learn about fungi, and we can use them to fight climate change in many different surprising ways.
So, in the huge concern on what will happen to fungi and what fungi will do the rest of their life under a rapidly changing climate, this is the big, big paper I came across. Here it is. Wake up call. Rapid increase in human fungal diseases under climate change. Rising temperatures and extreme weather are setting the stage for increases in fungal diseases. New pathogenic fungi are emerging, and known threats are spreading and evolving. So that's a big wake up call on fungi and climate change.
Thanks, Peter. It strikes me that maybe that organization that you mentioned, Paul, that focuses on the underground networks needs to be expanded or added to by a kind of worldwide warning system, the fungal warning system to flash, yellow or red lights if it turns out that fungus are reaching the point where they are truly, and they're maybe close to, as Peter and you all have pointed out, close to significantly damaging our health, our ecosystems, and our ability to fight climate change. We need to continue to find ways to truly make them heroes rather than villains.
Yeah,
And
I mean, of course, I mean, we think of the World Wide Web, we just think of the internet, right? The original World Wide Web is a fungal network, which still, you
yeah, in fact, it's called the Wood Wide Web, if I could pronounce it, the Wood Wide Web.
know.
That seems to be an established term in the fungal community. So we hope any of the members of the fungal community who are watching today won't wince as they hear us possibly misinterpret some research. We're doing our best as non-fungal experts, but as folks who recognize how critical they are to our lives, our ecosystems, our health, and our ability to fight climate change. Thanks, Peter and Paul. And before we wrap up, I'd just like to briefly mention a few of the sort of the headlines that you may have missed in recent days about climate change. The first is a sort of a technology I hadn't heard of before. Every night, some 75,000 gallons of water are frozen at a hospital in Louisville, Kentucky. The hospital used to get all its air conditioning from a conventional system, but now 27 tanks of ice sustain a network of cold water pipes, keeping temperatures in patients comfortable. This type of thermal energy battery, known as ice batteries, is being added to buildings throughout the country. So that was one thing that was new to me in a positive domain. Switching to what are the usual articles about climate change, which are not particularly inspiring. A report came out showing that there has been literally zero progress to the goal that was set in 2015 worldwide of zero hunger. So in the past decade, we've made no progress, the 8 billion of us, in reducing the amount of hunger in the world. And of course, that relates, and Peter, you refer to this from time to time, that relates to meat. And another study was done, and it was titled Meatless Media, Meatless Media, that 96% of the stories in some of the major media publications that were looked at made no mention of meat as a climate driver. 96%, even though meat is right up there with most everything else and is one of the most significant actions that any individual can take. To nobody's surprise, I guess, another report came out saying 1/5, literally 1/5 of migratory species throughout the planet face extinction from climate change. On a positive note, and following up on a very interesting program we had a few weeks ago with Peter Bunyard and Rob Dillette about how forests can cool, study just came out that said that forests that were the most strictly protected in Tuscany in Italy had high temperatures 2 degrees C lower than forests that were less strictly protected, showing the cooling benefits of intact forests. Another distressing, to me at least, I suspect to you, bit of news is 4 years ago, to great fanfare, the so-called Net Zero Banking Alliance was formed, committing the world's largest banks to net zero. And guess what? They announced recently that alliance is disbanding, going out of business, not because they succeeded, but because they failed. So, anyway, there's more I could say. I think I'll leave us all there. Again, thanks to Paul, thanks to Peter, thanks to all of you who are loyal viewers over the years. We have well over 200 videos on every aspect of the climate crisis. We would like to ask you to like this video. That will help circulate it more widely, to subscribe to our channel, to go to our website, climateemergencyforum.org. Take a look at the articles, and while you're there, take a look at that round, I think it's round donate button, and press it if you can. It would be much appreciated. We're a frugal organization, but we still need some support to make these programs every week. Please leave your comments. Tell us what you thought of today's program. Make suggestions for future programs, and be sure to come back next week when we'll be back with another edition of the Climate Emergency Forum. Thank you so much.